Hi, my name is Lambrecht Wessels. I am a conflict analyst and I'm starting this channel to do a series of interviews about the conflict in Syria. I'm starting with Nikolaos van Dam. He is the former Dutch special envoy for Syria and the author of two books, The Struggle for Power in Syria and Destroying a Nation, the Civil War in Syria. I have divided the interview into three parts. It starts with questions about the beginning of the conflict, some of the perceptions and misperceptions on how it started. The second part is about the province of Idlib, very important right now. And thirdly, I will ask questions about the current state of affairs and the negotiations. Please bear with me as I start immediately with my first question. The Syrian Revolution, as it started in 2011, militarized quite quickly. Till what degree was this driven by the internal opposition, in your view, and what was the role of proxy actors, let's say secondary actors like the Gulf states?
Well, I think it started peacefully, but not for very long, because there were all kinds of people who had a lot of things to settle with the regime from a long time ago, including the Muslim Brotherhood, others, but they didn't have the weapons, at least not that much. But if in a peaceful demonstration you have one armed man among the opposition or two, then it escalates very soon. But let me add, of course, that the repression, the severe behavior of the regime triggered, of course, counter-violence. But I think various countries have in the beginning made a serious effort to arrange a kind of compromise, including Saudi Arabia, but it was to no avail. Probably also because already the conflict had escalated into violence gradually, and then all of a sudden much more. And then afterwards, lots of arms poured in. For instance, also the Turks, they really tried to have a settlement, and the former Minister of Foreign Affairs, at that time Minister of Foreign Affairs, he spoke 6 hours with President al-Assad, but to no avail. And then they switched completely towards the opposition, and they allowed them to ship in arms, and they themselves sent arms and so on. And as far as I'm concerned, or my observations have been that military interventions almost always lead to disasters. And most countries that have intervened will feel the counter effect of it, the disadvantages of it. Including the Turks, for instance, because thanks to them, indirectly, the Kurds in the north of Syria have gained a powerful position, like in Iraq, but they don't want that, of course. And these Kurds are more or less the same as the PKK in Turkey. Mm-hmm. In any case, all these wars have triggered or strengthened the Kurdish national idea. At first, each separate country had its Kurdish national movement, Kurdish nationalist movement, like in Iraq or in Iran or Turkey or Syria. And when I visited Mullah Mustafa Barzani as a student in 1971, what struck me was that he was interested only in Iraq. It was already a big problem enough, of course. He was not interested in that sense to cooperate with Kurds in other countries. But gradually, I don't want to say there's real cooperation, but the influence of the nationalist movements, in plural, in various of these countries has had an influence on other countries. And in the present conflict in Syria, the Kurds in Iraq, they want to have a say also with what is happening in the Kurdish area in Syria. So in general, the peaceful demonstrations, the opposition, of course, wants to claim that it was peaceful all along. But you cannot say that they were all peaceful. Part of them not peaceful. And usually it takes a few people only to escalate things and to direct developments a completely different direction.
Of course. Did the opposition make a miscalculation, given the potential support from Hezbollah, from Iran, from Russia for the regime? Was there ever a realistic chance of militarily overthrowing or competing with the regime? Wasn't that a strategic military mistake, or was it likely at that time that could happen?
Well, all depended to a great extent to the support they received from abroad. The opposition generally says that if Russia and Iran, with the help also of Hezbollah, would not have interfered, they would easily have toppled the regime. And it may be true. But on the other hand, if the opposition wouldn't have had this huge military support and financial support, other kinds of support, they wouldn't have had the slightest chance. So, and that's also one of the reasons why, in particular, Russia is heavily involved now, because the regime was shaken. So
this was the summer of 2015 when they
yes,
intervened.
that's right. And then in September they intervened. So in a way, if the other countries would not have intervened that much, Russia would not have intervened that much. And so again, foreign military intervention triggers other forces. So, but it was not a planned thing, the Syrian Revolution. It was, let's say, a spontaneous thing, because also, well, in the first place, many Syrians were, of course, fed up with the Baath regime, but it was a reality of almost of half a century. But they saw the successes in Egypt, in Tunisia, in Libya. In Egypt, for instance, the president resigned after demonstrations. And in Tunisia, the president, he fled the country after demonstrations. And in Libya, well, there the story was quite different, because thanks to, or due to foreign intervention, the regime of Gaddafi was toppled and he was killed. So what they did there, they were intervening on the basis of responsibility to protect, the Security Council principle, security, or the responsibility to protect. But it's not only that's to protect the population against the regime, but it needs aftercare, because if you have removed, I'm talking about it in simple terms, if you have removed the regime, then the others all want to take over, if you have seen in Libya, as you have seen in Libya. But they didn't want any foreign interference in that. So now you see 17 years later, it's still war. 7 years later, it's still war. So the people in Syria, the demonstrators, thought we're going to be helped. And they saw, for instance, that the American ambassador, Ford, and also his French colleague, they went to Hama to, well, it was in fact an expression also of sympathy, support for the opposition. And in a way, you cannot, as an ambassador, if you want your country to play a future role, well, if you have made a choice of the opposition, you cannot play an intermediary role anymore. And one of the reasons, perhaps why I think he did this on instructions, or at least he consulted with Washington. But many observers, and I would say less informed observers, or the wrong information observers, they thought the president is going to fall, his regime is going to fall. It was a mixture of wishful thinking and lack of knowledge of the regime, because anyone who knows the regime, who has studied the regime, could predict that there was going to be a bloodbath. Any party that tries to topple the regime, it will be a bloodbath. I wrote this 15 years before the start of the revolution. I predicted such a scenario in my first book, and it was not that difficult to predict. But the people who were supporting the opposition, I think they were not aware of it, or they just thought Assad will fall. And it's even that President Obama, he said he must step down or step aside and so on. But he did this because he thought, I should say this before he falls. He expected them to fall any moment. So he wanted to be on the right side of, so-called right side of history. so that he could say later, yes, I already asked him to, I demanded his stepping down.
Can you say something about the strength of the regime? Why it was very unlikely that they would fall, or very unlikely that they would make any significant political concessions or changes?
Yes, well, the regime is very strong in the sense that it has a very good organization, very effective also in the form of suppression. And it's all a matter of nominating exactly the people who you can fully trust in the most sensitive positions. And at first, between 1963 and 1970, there were all kinds of groups competing for power. But one after the other was eliminated until only one faction of then not yet president, but later President Hafez al-Assad had the monopoly of power. And many people stayed in their positions for 30 years, or perhaps even more. So, and any person who was considered to be a threat, or even the slightest doubt, they would eliminate him. It's this well-known saying: you commit suicide with 2 bullets, so it's not suicide. Or put in prison and so on. So they would deal with their opponents also from the regime and the party, Baath Party, in a very cruel way, very often. So if you can expect that, I don't want to say that you shouldn't, that they were not having all kinds of reasons to topple the regime. But to put an example, if you want to kill a lion, then you must be sure before you start that you are stronger and you're better armed in order not to be killed yourself, which is what happened. So all these interferences were also not, most of these interferences by other countries, in particular the United States, Turkey, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and then also Britain and France, but particularly the first I mentioned, they did not coordinate. They had military operations centers in the south of Turkey and in Jordan. But so every country channeled its support through that center or separately, but all to their own favorites. They were not really making plans that they should all coordinate. So it was in a way a mess. And so it didn't have the effect what they wanted. And even if the revolution would be successful in the sense that they would have had the power, they would have taken over power, I doubt strongly that they would have implemented the principles which they agreed upon in the Riyadh conference and in 2015 and also later on in Riyadh. They had a set of ideas which I think most Western countries would sympathize with it completely if it would not be their own thoughts. So it was, they wanted a democratic system, they want a pluralistic system, they want full equality among all religions, no, not any discrimination, women equality and so on. I don't know whether, perhaps also they mentioned secular, but let's leave that aside. But if you look at some of the signatories of the military factions, if you look at, for instance, the Ahrar al-Sham or Jaish al-Islam or the Muslim Brotherhood, I cannot imagine that they want a equality of religion. They want, of course, the Sunnis to be predominant, if not having a monopoly of power. They are far from secular. You can be religious and secular, but I think when it comes, if they would have power, have obtained power, I think it would have been a complete different. So it was a compromise, in a way a good compromise, but when it comes to having power, it is different. So, in fact, the opposition failed, and it would have been better. I think they might even have been more dangerous if they would have remained fully peaceful. But it was not in the hand of the majority, if you can speak of majorities and minorities.
Okay. Continuing on the, let's say, the structure and the power of the regime, in both your books you describe a process by which over the years it's a smaller and smaller Alawi Assad clan who have gotten power. That wasn't the Ba'athists' aim in the beginning, but that's, you describe very clearly, and you summarize in the second book how that happens. Now there's a truism, there's this joke or expression that in Syria that Adam is in power. The Alawis, the Druze, and the Messahanim, the followers of the Messiah, so the Christians, they're about a quarter of the population, and that the 3/4 Sunni are less so in power. If you look at the power base outside of these three groups, are they very supportive of Assad? Do they feel they don't have another choice, or how do you assess, let's say, his local support?
I know the expression Adas, which means Alawiyin, Alawis, Druze, and Ismailiyin. I don't know the other expression, but I think a dictatorship applies to all people in the country, to every inch of the country. So the dictatorship also applies to the Druze and the Alawis and the Ismailiyin and the Christians. So you can say that it is a section of the Alawi community and a section of the Druze and others, Ismailiyin, who have, it's a kind of elite within a society, within a community, but not the whole community. Selection, well, they were not all selected, but they are in power, and particularly Alawis. I don't say the Alawis because that would be a distortion of the realities. But when it comes to a war like the present war, then it is about the perception. So the regime, the repressive institutions are very easily identifiable as Alawi, although there are also, if you look at the armed forces, it's a reflection of the composition of society. So in the armed forces, the Sunnis are far in the majority, but they are not in the elite units. They don't have the best arms and so on. So it's about if the perception is the Alawis are suppressing us, then you have this dynamic of sectarianism, that they think all Alawis support us. And what is true, the regime for many years has been favoritizing Alawis in the sense of scholarships and so on. So they had more chances than others, but still the Alawi region is very poor. So it is not reflecting on the Alawi area, but it's the dynamics of distrust. So in such a war, people of the Alawi community, they feel less threatened if they would choose the side of the regime. And the same applies to Christians and Druze, but many are also against the regime. But they have no choice. And there are theories that the regime has done this on purpose, but making it into a sectarian conflict. It is not a sectarian conflict. It's a conflict between a dictatorship and oppressed people. But on top of that, but you must also look in the further back in history, there are several turning points in Syrian history, and one of the main turning points on the issue of sectarianism is the period of the end of the 70s, beginning of the 80s, when people from the Muslim Brotherhood, or people who split off of them, they started to kill Alawis, to assassinate Alawis, whether Baathist or not. And they hoped to polarize society between the Sunni majority and these minorities. As a result of they would win. But they made the mistake in the sense that numbers don't count that much. What counts is who is in the position of power. But at the end of all these killings was the bloodbath of Hama in 1982, which was in a way, it sounds very disrespectful, a miniature bloodbath of things to come after 2011, because then you had many Hamas. So all these kinds of history, for the Alawites, this is psychologically very important. If they would say, if Muslim Brotherhood people will get the chance, they would kill us. You have even this time, this fatwa of Ibn Taymiyyah saying that it's no problem. You can kill Alawites. The Islamic State did this the same. So it is not a sectarian war, but it became inevitable that this dimension was going to play an important role. And if you ever want to have a reconciliation, what is very important then is to have mutual respect between, for instance, Alawis and Sunnis, that they can make a differentiation between the ruling people and the people in general.
Quite clear. In the beginning of the conflict, there was this move. There's two questions here. The regime let go a bunch of Islamist opposition people from their prisons, and also in the beginning, they didn't attack ISIS much when they came on the scene. Why this tactic? Why this?
Well, concerning the releasing of Islamist people, there are various opinions. And I am more inclined to follow the idea that it was part of the reconciliation, an effort. Various people have demanded the release of these prisoners that happen to be Islamist. And also, I cannot imagine, and then the idea that the regime wanted to portray as a kind of plan. In the Middle East, you have a lot of takhtit, mu'amara, what do you call it, the complot, it's all planned. So this was planned in order to achieve that they could portray the struggle in Syria between Islamist radicals and secularists and so on. Why would if you cannot perhaps always argue with logic, but what's the use for them? I mean, the Syrian regime was disliked anywhere in the world, and it would also, in many places of the world, they didn't have that many friends. So would, for instance, the United States all of a sudden say, well, it's a struggle between Islamists and the regime, we will help the regime? No, I think it's fully... And also, the thing is that under, let's say, previous circumstances, if they would release them, then they could easily capture them again. So I'm more inclined to... But I should say that various specialists, they say it was a plan. I don't see the logic of such a plan. So how could you release someone who's later on going to undermine your position? I don't see the logic. But let them cite the logic then about the relations between IS and the regime. Of course, the regime was very anti-Islamic State, Daesh, but for them it was war economy. They wanted to put their means, which were restricted, limited, in the best way, the most economical way. So, since many Western and other countries wanted to get rid of IS, they let the other countries do the fighting against IS. The regime. So they preferred to have others do as much as that, and in order to, in the end, finish off IS or to recapture these areas. So I think it has. I know that, for instance, the regime sometimes used the threat of IS. For instance, there was the town of Salamiya, which is a mainly Ismaili town. The people there, they would know that if IS occupies us, then we will be killed because they consider us heretics, like the Alawis. So the regime said, if we can protect you, but you must deliver soldiers to our army. So in this way, they used the IS against others. But I know that there's theories that they cooperated with IS against others, but it's like, perhaps we could come to that later on, with the Kurds. It's not out of friendship that Assad armed the Kurds, but he armed the Kurds against other enemies in order to later on regain his position there.
Speaking of the Kurdish area of Hasaka, Raqqa and Deir ez-Zor, where especially Hasaka, of course, the northeastern provinces of Syria, which are the areas I want to go to next, and specifically this area currently dominated by the Syrian SDF, Syrian Defense Forces, the Kurds with the seculars, where the Americans are embedded. Quite importantly, about 3 or 4 months ago, during an interaction, the Americans, with the help of the Kurds, they killed in Deir ez-Zor 200 Russian mercenaries, and this was there was not really a response. Moscow was very, very quiet, and so for me there's 2 possible scenarios for that area. Of course, there could be another scenario as well, and I'm going to, if you indulge me, quickly describe them, and I'm going to ask you which one you think is more likely. The first scenario would be a northeastern Syria, the province of Raqqa, Deir ez-Zor, and Hasaka, under Kurdish and opposition control with embedded US soldiers, while Reconstruction would be financed by the EU, which Trump has suggested. That would be the first scenario. Or 2, a gradual withdrawal of American troops, which Trump has also suggested at the same time. And then a deal between the PYD, the YPG, the Kurds, and the regime, and a gradual takeover also of that territory by the regime. That would, of course, entail a loss of our troops, local Kurdish troops, against ISIS and possible refugees. Which of these 2 scenarios do you see as most likely?
Well, there's a general tendency in Western countries to support areas in which the opposition is in power. But I cannot imagine that there will be any substantial reconstruction aid to these areas, because in a way they are waiting for the final war. So why reconstruct an area where there is not at all peace yet? So I think the Americans, they want for the time being to have a kind of bargaining chip. They want to stay there until there is a political solution to their liking, or at least to a certain extent to their liking. But I don't think that it may be very costly. And another complicating factor is that the relations between the United States and Turkey are complicated by the fact that the Turks don't want the Kurds there to be in power because of the influence on the PKK. So I would guess that for the Americans, the relationship, the military and other relationships with Turkey are more important with the Kurds. And one issue is also that if we talk about the Kurds there, it is PYD, YPG, and they are not at all liked by most other Kurdish parties. You have about 15 Kurdish parties, and most of them are against this PYD because they are having a very authoritarian way of behavior and actions. So I would expect that there is still a long time to go because the Americans will not withdraw tomorrow or the day after. So they want to stay there, but they want also to leave because it will cost them and it will not bring them anything. So maybe they come to a deal that the Turks will be in power there, but that can also not be. The relationship with Turkey is very complicated because if you don't look at not only at the northeast but also the northwest, in the province of Idlib, the Turks are embedded there. They don't want the refugees to come out. But they cannot either eliminate the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, let's call it Al-Qaeda or Nusra, because although they are the most powerful group there, but trying to eliminate Hayat Tahrir al-Sham it's impossible to do this with so-called precision, because they're in the middle of populated areas, they're in the middle of other areas which are controlled by the National Army, which is the new alliance of opposition groups. And this Syrian National Army, opposition army, they are also including all kinds of former people from Tahrir al-Sham. I mean, people choose the side which they find most best or least bad. So the Turks may have a kind of confrontation with the Russians on this, but in a way the Syrian regime can also wait. I mean, as long as that area is not a threat towards the regime or towards the Russians, they can also argue that, well, let the Turks try to eliminate these groups. And also, I'm sure that the Americans would like to eliminate them, like they wanted to eliminate IS. So this conflict is in the waiting, but it's not that the regime wants, of course they want, but they will apply the same tactics of war economy. If another can do it for you, why not? And all these fighters that have been deported there, by the regime, they have not been deported there in order to negotiate in future. So there's not any chance to negotiate with them. And by the way, yes, they have had demonstrations in various towns in Idlib where they are saying, well, the regime, we don't want to negotiate and we want al-Assad to fall and to exit, before justice and so on. But they're on the verge of being defeated, at least that's what I expect. So it's perhaps an honorable defeat, but there's not any chance for negotiating. Adding to that, during this whole conflict, the party which thinks it can win is not in a mood to negotiate, only for the bühne, for the show.
Yeah.
So the northeast, it's also for the regime, they can wait. You have, on the other side of the river, you have already the conflict between the United States and Turkey and the Kurds.
Yeah.
So reconstruction, I don't expect it. It's like in Lebanon, where the Lebanese wanted others to invest in Lebanon while the war was still going on. But people from abroad thought, well, the Lebanese themselves must invest. But in these areas, there's not much to invest because they don't have, the funds are not there. And even if I may talk about the reconstruction aid, people argue that it should not be going through the channels of the regime because of the corruption. Of course, that's so. Well, the people are in any case the real victims of all of this, wherever they are, whether they're under Assad or under opposition areas. But if you would, first, are the funds available and are people willing to pay? So if both answers would be possible, the money is there and the people are going to reconstruct, or the companies get all the money, it doesn't mean that there can be reconstruction swiftly, because you do not only need the money, but you need the people to build. So, and they're not there. So, if you want to reconstruct, I remember in Indonesia there was an earthquake in Java, and they wanted to reconstruct. They didn't have enough people, so they brought them in from other provinces. But in Syria, it's not that big country, and many people are abroad. So it's not the technical, the money and the political willingness to provide the money, if it's there at all, but it's also the human capacity. And you should imagine that if you have your house destroyed and you are for 10 or 15 years in the rubble, it's not the best recipe for stability and reconciliation and so on, next to all the victims which have fallen.
Alrighty. So if we look then indeed at Idlib, there is analysis that says there'll be kind of a stop and start war for the Russians to extract concessions from the West, or there'll be say a full defeat of that area, or the Turks might over a longer time get the opportunity to wane away the, let's say, HTS, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, from the other opposition militias. Which one of the scenarios is most likely, or it's very difficult to predict?
I think the Western or other countries who would provide funds for reconstruction, I think they are not in the political mood to say, well, if you don't create another humanitarian disaster in Idlib, then we will pay you. It doesn't work. It already doesn't work without Idlib, and I don't think it's also a way of what do you call it? Through intimidation. If we don't attack, then you must pay. But if they have paid, then they may attack as well. Because one thing I'm sure of, that in the end the regime wants to reconquer all territories. So it's a matter of time. If they cannot do it now, then they may do it later. The question mark is what the Turks really want. They don't want refugees, any more refugees. So that's why they don't want a conflict there. But still, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham is there, and many other opposition movements are there. But let's say Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which is the biggest. I don't think the Turks are going to, that they on their part want to eliminate them. They would like them to be eliminated. But doing it is much more costly. They will also lose a lot of soldiers. Because not just by flying over and destroying them. No, it's much more complicated, as we have seen with Daesh, with the Islamic State and other, in Aleppo and in Mosul and many other places. So I don't see that there's any willingness for Western and Arab countries, please don't attack Idlib. So if you don't do that, we will pay. And even so, if they would pay, then they can attack us anyhow. So one big question is what the Turks are going to do. They have observation areas around there. And probably the regime first is going to attack the weaker spots. And this is where not the HTS is Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, but the others. And it is not in one military operations, it's gradually. But in any way, it's bound to be a disaster. But no reason for other countries to, like in Aleppo or in Mosul. There's a huge difference between Aleppo and Mosul in the perception in Western countries. In Mosul, which was also a humanitarian disaster, it was not such a problem because it were Western countries that were attacking, and in Aleppo it was portrayed much more negative because it was the regime which was attacking. But there you had also, like in Idlib, a mixture of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, at that time it was perhaps not yet called that way, with that name, anyhow, the Nusra or Al-Qaeda related organizations and others, so among one another, mixed.
Okay. If we are then looking long term in terms of negotiations, I want to move over to the, say, long-term scenarios or changes and negotiations. It's very difficult to imagine, with the Iranian and Russian support the regime has, any kind of South African style transition of truth and reconciliation. There's a scenario, of course, in which the regime would take over the whole territory. But my first question is, it's actually the role of Russia. How committed to not just the regime's survival, but Assad, particularly his survival, is Russia? Is there a negotiation space between Russia and the regime that could be used in any way?
I think the Russians simply want the regime in power because this is their main ally, and if the name of the president would be different, it would be the same for them. It's not personal, like it doesn't work that way, that because they like the president or not, that they... And the regime is of course also linked to the president. So the officers respect him and one another as long as he's there. As if he's not there, then there will be a lot of conflict. But there is a two-way possibility of pressure, because what I've seen thus far, the regime is not going to do anything the Russians want them to do. As long as it would threaten their power, they would never say, for instance, all right, the president will go because the Americans like him to go, and then what next? So the space between Russia and the Syrians is very limited. I mean, for negotiations, for the Russians to say you must do this and that. The Russians must say to them, you will stay in power, then it's all right for us. I don't see much space anyhow for negotiations, because many opportunities have been lost. I mean, the war or the conflict is now more than 7 years going on, and the regime is on the verge of winning in the sense of there's still a lot to be conquered, but it's in their favor apparently, so they don't want to negotiate. They don't want to negotiate with parties that say, we want to eliminate you and you should leave. I mean, this is one of the points from the very beginning. I have been arguing also this with the opposition. If you negotiate on basis of two things, which is the Geneva communique of 2012, which is quite a neutral communique, which is could be a very good instrument for negotiations, and then some Security Council resolutions, particularly 2254, which is a resolution which demands the regime to allow food, lift the blockades, release prisoners, and so on. These are all quite objective. But there's a third element, and this started immediately after the conference in Geneva in 2012. Mrs. Clinton immediately says, yes, but Assad must go. So if you make it into two words, the Security Council resolution in Geneva, it's okay. But if you have an extra demand, you can make that demand. But if you have negotiations, it means that there should be compromise, with both parties at the end of negotiations still existing. But if you want to negotiate your opponent out of existence, and he is moreover in power, it's a guarantee for failure, of course. People are saying, but the regime doesn't want to negotiate anyhow. So it may be true. I think the regime doesn't really want to share power. That's correct. But at least you must try. So the opposition, and I told that several times in Istanbul. I thought that it's more useful to them to have some criticism than to say, well, we support you, the president must go, and secondly, not being able to achieve it. So what I'm missing in the positions of the conflicting parties is not that they have so-called moral principles or so, but that they miss the link of how they're going to achieve what they want. And that is, I think, a very important thing. And what also counts, of course counts, is the number of victims. Some 7 years ago, I argued, is it 7 or not? 6 years ago, 6.5 years, on the first commemoration of the revolution, which started. So it was in March 2012. I argued with others in an interview. It's up to me to choose, I would prefer 10,000 dead, which was at the time, than 300,000, and which means you must have dialogue with the regime. But others said, no, we will never want that portrait of this president, and we're going to continue. And at that time, I mentioned 300,000. It was not really in my imagination that it was going to be more than 500,000. You must take the human suffering into account, hugely into account. If you achieve what you want, then still you have the 500,000 people. Terrible. But you could still say, well, we had success because we won. But then, what I mentioned earlier, then you must implement the principles which you signed for. And if you're not going to do that, then the whole revolution is also lost. So, on paper, they have very good ideas, except that for when it comes to negotiations, they have cut off. Of course, the regime calls them terrorists and so on. And they call the president this man with many people with blood on their hands, and they have a lot of blood on their hands, that they should be disappeared. We can never cooperate with you, but they are in power. So that is a huge problem. So negotiations, I don't see any. It's past scenario or past episode, except for the fact that it's not only the Syrian parties that should negotiate and come to not only negotiate but also come to a solution. I say that because in other conflicts people want to negotiate all the time but never come to a solution. In the Israeli-Arab conflict, and they have all the things in power.
It's the perpetual peace process. The Israel-Palestine is the perpetual peace process.
They want to talk. Of course, we can talk. But they have also everything in their hands, so there is no real negotiations, because the occupier negotiating with the occupied and wanting to keep all these territories and so on, it's no possibility, no real negotiations. So you have next to Geneva, you have Istana, but it's only military negotiations. And it's all temporarily. I mean, for the regime, it is to have armistices, or you have the reduction of violence, but it's all with in mind to reconquer the whole country.
Without the embedding of the U.S. Army, these 2,000 quote-unquote observers in the east, that would be probably quite quickly overrun. Does the opposition, including the Kurds, they need territory to be able to negotiate? Without the territory, there's no need for the regime to negotiate if they have the entire territory, obviously.
I think also that, well, even if they have now this territory still under control, it is not that they have 3/4 of the territory of the country under control, and they can expect it to be defeated in the future. So they need territory for negotiations, but the regime, the time that if there was ever a time that they wanted to negotiate, this time is over. So even if they had that, this is what the Americans think, they have a bargaining chip. But I don't think that the regime will give in to that. Then I think they prefer to have it occupied by other parties until the time is ripe to defeat them.
And what, thinking out of the box, if that particular territory, so most of Raqqa, Hasaka, and Deir ez-Zor would be protected in a way, frozen in the current situation with this American embedding, if that would continue for 5, 10 or 15 years, then you'd have a separate parallel economy, a separate parallel territory. Then the regime would be relatively stable and that area would be relatively stable. But you divide the country. Is there anything in that scenario?
I don't think so. There's one thing which all Syrians agree upon, that they wanted to have full territorial integrity. The problem is, however, that they all want the power also. So that's a difficult combination. But I think that the regime can wait they're not going to attack if there would be a confrontation between the Americans and the Russians. So then they wait. And that goal can always be reunited again. But I don't think that there's any willingness for the regime to compromise, if there has ever been a willingness for the regime to compromise. But I've always thought if you have dialogue, you can exploit it and you can perhaps achieve something. But if you refuse dialogue from the beginning, well, then you cut yourself off. Yeah. But the regime, the opposition has, of course, thought over the years that we are going to help them. Well, they have, I mean, we Western countries, yeah. Arab countries, they have been helped, but not enough. So if you have certain goals and you need certain means to achieve them, if you don't have these means or you don't want to implement them, you must scale down your aims. And that this is one of the dilemmas. The aims, the ideals remain the same, but they cannot be achieved. And this is what you see also in many Western countries. They want the aim to remain the same, and so they don't want to adapt yet. They come later on to the realities on the ground.
So what should the EU, what should the West, what should the USA do right now and in the coming years?
Well, I think that many things are too late now. What they should not have done is to close the channels for dialogue, to close their embassies, to demand the removal of the regime without aiming to do so. So I think gradually they will abide by the realities that this regime, whether you like it or not, and many people don't like it at all. They hate it, but these are the realities. So they may have to recognize that the regime is going to stay and still try to come to a kind of compromise, but I think it will be difficult because after so much bloodshed, neither side wants a compromise. So they may as well accept the new situation, but it will go very slowly because they didn't achieve anything in the positive. Because since the revolution started in March 2011, the period, the situation in Syria before that was much better than now. But the revolution was also triggered by the Arab Spring, but also by economic factors. For instance, many people migrated from the dried out areas to the cities because there was a long drought in Syria. Many people had a very difficult economic situation. So that was also a trigger, but this is now much more. There is, apart from the fact that the economy is very, very bad, the social fabric of the society has been destroyed to a great extent. So actually there is even more reason now for revolution against the regime. And I don't see how the regime can eliminate corruption because they are very much part of it. The whole system, also in the opposition, among the military opposition, corruption, suppression, intimidation is part of the system. Also in the opposition areas, there are many groups who demand money from other Syrians by intimidation and so on, at roadblocks and so on. So, let's say, one part of the Syrians, they intimidate and exploit the others. So to bring this back to a normal situation where everyone goes to his work and has an income, or many people at least, is very difficult to achieve. So there is bound to be huge tension in Syrian society. The people who are inside Syria may have to accept the situation as it is. Doesn't mean they like the regime, but they will keep silent because they want to survive. The Syrians outside Syria will keep the revolution alive. They are safe outside, so they can say everything they like, but they cannot return. That's also an alternative. And even if they were silent abroad, they may not be able to return, because in Syria, under this regime, it is not only that you must have been silent, neutral, but I have various friends who were at meeting, for instance, in Syria, and some people criticized the president, and then they didn't say anything, and they were criticized by people from the regime. Yes, but you didn't say anything against it. So it's not only not saying anything, you're in a way intimidated to say something in support of the regime. And that is, for many, a dilemma.
Obviously. I'd like to end with, is there anything particularly important on this conflict, current developments or issues that we haven't covered that you'd like to share or say something about?
Well, I think many Western and Arab leaders haven't the faintest idea that they are co-responsible for the disaster which has happened by their intervention. So I think, and they will not easily recognize it. I mean, let's say, if you talk about legitimacy, a revolution obtains its legitimacy if it has won. But if it has failed, it's completely different. So this is what I'm missing in many countries, that this awareness, they wanted something good. They wanted democracy in Syria, they wanted plural society. In fact, more or less all these principles which were supported in Riyadh, but they didn't take into account that to achieve it, you had to topple the regime and then hope that there will be others, which I didn't expect, to come to implement these principles. They have remained in the stage of declarations. Of course, there have to be declarations, but declarations have to be implemented. I don't want to say that, for instance, the Security Council should not declare something on a situation and criticize it, but at least there must be an awareness or a will to implement it as well. But of course, if it means war, interventing in, many countries don't want it, and I think it's also justified. But the link between realizing that, well, you have also the issue of moral high ground and ethical principles. Various politicians, also in Western countries, they think, well, we want a just thing for the Syrians, we want democracy, we want the regime and the people with blood on their hands, they must be prosecuted, they must be in the International Criminal Court and so on. But they didn't achieve it. There was not, I would say, hardly any chance to achieve it. It resulted partly also in this huge bloodshed, and they also encouraged, in a way, the opposition also to take this same principled stand, which I don't say it is by principles is a bad stand, no, not at all. But if you look at the costs, then the principles should have been, or the demands should have been scaled down. So when you're outside Syria, you can easily talk, and you must say it also in front of your colleagues, most probably. But if you think about practicalities, it is not only the principles that count or the moral high ground that counts, it is what you achieve. So, and that means pragmatism. So in a way, if you can achieve something more, much more than what has been achieved now, and it's about what the people obtain from it, the Syrians. In many discussions, the Syrians are not even taken account of. So this war, which turned out to be developed into a war by proxy. Of course, it needs also the cooperation of the various countries involved to put the peace of Syria above their own regional or other interests. So, if you don't achieve anything, then I think the moral high ground becomes, in a way, an immoral. If you look at the results, the immoral high ground, and ethical becomes unethical. And many people don't like pragmatism, but pragmatism is taking into account the realities on the ground.
Thank you very much for this interview, Mr. Van Dam.